Institute. He's formerly worked with the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace as an analyst for environmental and disarmament issues and desk officer for the English-speaking countries. Kishore earned his degrees in political science and economics from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. In college, he was executive director of the Michigan Review and an economic policy intern at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's worked on as an international economist for the Bureau of Labor Statistics in D.C. and graduated from the University of Toronto also. Okay, so he's got a long bio, but I'll let him prove himself with his great words of wisdom. So won't you welcome Kishore? Thank you, Kishore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you, Lee, also, for having me here. It was Lee's idea that I come and visit Honolulu. The last few years, Lee and I have been together at something called Acton University, which, for those of you who don't know the Acton Institute, we're a think tank based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that promotes economic education among religious leaders. So we try to bring together God and mammon, two things that don't always seem to go together. But we try to do this with varying levels of degrees of success. And in Grand Rapids, we have a great event every June, a 4-day seminar called Acton University. And Lee's been the last few years, and she's always in my lectures, and she's always there, whenever I'm talking about political philosophy and different things. So she said, we found out I was coming to Kona. The previous week I was there for a week, and so she said, I have to come out to Honolulu. It's my second time in Hawaii. I came here in 1978, so I don't remember too much about it from that time.
You were 2 years old.
I was 7 years old at the time, but it's great to be here, and I'm very impressed by this gathering. Very professional, esteemed guest here. We do something similar in Rome. We call it Campus Martius because we look at it as a training ground. The way the ancient Romans used to train soldiers, we think we were training people intellectually, spiritually for the battle of ideas. And so I'm sure you're doing something very similar here. So it's nice to know that we have partners in crime when it comes to being embattled minorities in very left-leaning societies and left-leaning cultures. Coming from the People's Republic of Ann Arbor, I'm used to being in the minority when it comes to economics and politics and religion and all these kind of matters. So it's always nice to feel like you're not completely alone, and there's always good things that happen when people associate freely and to discuss important things. So what I want to talk about tonight is, I think, very topical. If I can read my notes here. It's about the future of free trade under Pope Francis and Donald Trump. Now, most people would not put those two together in the same sentence, would they? I'm assuming most of us here are conservatives or libertarians or some combination thereof, which means that we're generally in favor of free markets and free trade. But if you looked at the last election cycle, no one was defending free trade. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the North American Free Trade Agreement, all of those came under great criticism. And this isn't anything new. Pope Francis in Rome, if there's one thing he's been very clear about, and he's been not so clear about many things when it comes to the Catholic Church, but if there's one thing we know is that he is not a fan of global capitalism. He's been criticizing it almost from the beginning of his pontificate. So that gives us at the Acton Institute, especially in Rome, quite a bit to do. But as I say, when I'm asked about Pope Francis, he's good for business. We get asked to comment on everything Pope Francis says. Therefore, our media impressions go up. But more importantly, people realize that there's actually a debate to be had. That this is not simply a matter, if any of you are Catholic, you would know this, the Pope is not infallible on economics. He's infallible on faith and morals, but not on economics. So these are issues on which we're free to discuss. The Pope has already said that he is looking for engagement on these issues. Whether he means it and whether he's actually open to change might be a different matter. But when it comes to economics, I'd say he was even a precursor to the great kind of backlash against globalization that I think has been building for at least since the financial crisis, if not slightly before. Coming from a town like Flint, Michigan, which is my hometown, so I asked about where in Michigan you're from. I know very much from experience that logical, rational arguments in favor of free markets do not always win people over. A place like Flint, Michigan is a very democratic, union-controlled city, which has suffered quite a bit since NAFTA has come in and since GM and other U.S. automakers have faced competition. And there's always been a tendency to blame these, let's say, free market ideologies for the downfall of Flint, without seeming to blame the Democratic Party or the trade unions or all these other things. I will say that Donald Trump gave, I think, one of the best lines of the campaign in Flint, Michigan, where he said that it used to be we built cars in Flint, Michigan, and you couldn't drink the water in Mexico. Now we build cars in Mexico and you can't drink the water in Flint, which to me was a perfect snapshot of the kind of disaffection, right, of everyday Americans. Maybe not for those of us in the intellectual class, not those of us who work in politics, who to some degree live in a type of bubble. And those of us who were with the Trump campaign from the beginning knew it was a bubble. And I think for that, they were ahead of the curve. So between these two leaders, Pope Francis and Donald Trump, we have two great critics of a certain type of free trade, let me put it that way. The differences between them are quite obvious, especially on something like immigration. The Pope, like most Catholic leaders, is very critical of people who want to build walls, both metaphorically and literal walls.
Except the one around the Vatican.
Except for the one around the Vatican. But if we push the Pope on that, he might get rid of those walls too. So you never know. As we know, one of Trump's biggest campaign promises, and most popular items, is building a wall. But beyond that, I think the similarities in their general political styles they have actually more in common than meets the eye. They're both elite leaders running against elites, and that's something that's quite remarkable. The fact that the first Jesuit Pope actually runs against the Vatican might surprise some. The fact that a wealthy businessman can speak for the poor, I think, is also equally surprising. But in a way, there's a certain credibility that goes with that. To be able to be a credible leader, it's not just a matter of going with the flow, not just a matter of protecting the interests of your group. To be able to speak for the whole, or the common good, as the Catholic Church puts it, is something that is the sign of a remarkable political leader. And I think that's one aspect that makes people like both Pope Francis and Donald Trump so admirable and so appealing to many disaffected people, disaffected Catholics, disaffected Americans, disaffected workers, all the people that those of us who work in the kind of punditry, intellectual think tank world treat in an abstract way. These are people who treat in a very realistic way, in a very flesh and blood kind of way. And I think that's something that all of us who work in intellectual fields need to remind ourselves of, and to really try to broaden our horizons and our contacts. Now, when it comes to the argument about free trade, it has to do with elites versus populists, populists who are running against the free trade agreements, if not against free trade itself, rigged systems. I think Bernie Sanders, we could have included him in this argument as well, to the point where he could even push Hillary Clinton against the very free trade agreement that her husband had signed in the early 90s. But more importantly, I think it's an argument for common sense over ideology. And that's something that those of us who study free market economics, those of us who've been part of the conservative libertarian movement, again, have taken for granted. We understand the arguments and for it from a logical, rational basis. But in terms of how it affects people's lives, in terms of how it affects societies, sometimes we forget the actual case for free markets. So what does it mean to be an advocate for free trade and a market economy? If you've read any of the great classical liberal economists and political thinkers, they always made the argument on behalf of the poor and middle classes. It was never an argument in favor of, let's say, the top of society. The top of society always takes care of itself. In a feudal society, there's never been a reason to argue in favor of the lords, right, against the serfs. It was always an argument from the bottom up, and that's something that I think that we've often forgotten, probably because of the success of our arguments. Free trade economics and globalization have been so successful at raising living standards that we actually complain about the, let's say, relative aspects of poverty and inequality, and not so much focus on how much gains in poverty reduction have been made absolutely across the world. It's to the point where absolute poverty and the lack of living conditions is looked at as a disease rather than as the natural state of mankind. And that is a tremendous victory. It's something that we often forget when we're arguing in favor of free markets, how much living standards have improved. I don't want to say just in the 10, 20, 30 years we've been arguing these themes, but going back since 1850. In 1850, the average lifespan of somebody was 24 years old. That increased to 35 years old virtually a decade later. We're now well into the 70s when it comes to that. And most of that reduction takes place at the beginning of life when it comes to reductions in maternal and infant mortality rates. So those are things that nobody will deny, whether you're on the right or the center or not political at all. Those are arguments that are no longer being had. All the shift of emphasis has been towards relative inequality, right? The fact that some get richer than others, not that some are actually getting poorer. So I think the biggest takeaway, the first of 4 points I want to make about this and what free traders have to do a better job of, is to speak less about free trade arguments in terms of an ideology or as a dogma, right? Much more the common sense, practical approach rather than an abstract ideological one. We need to realize that most economies are actually mixed. There's no such thing as a pure free market. Despite what we may read in a textbook, we know this politically. We know this society. We know all about the taxes and regulations and the levels of government interference. All economies are mixed. They're not simply a command or market economy, but they do tend to one direction or another. If you look at the freest economies in the world, places like Hong Kong and Singapore, and Ken was telling me about New Zealand yesterday, they tend to be smaller societies. They tend to be societies in which the levels of trust tend to be higher among individuals in a society. And as a result, they're much more practical. You don't need to make a big ideological argument about free markets. And in fact, left-wing parties tend to have greater success at introducing free market reforms than right-wing ones. The left is often considered to be friendlier to labor unions, friendlier to government in general. And so as a result, right, when the right comes in, it's looked at as a class warfare type of argument. You want to screw the poor or something like that, which we know is not the case. But the perception makes all the difference in the world. By making the argument from, let's say, the social or political point of view, it can be much more effective. And again, ideology tends to be also a common link between Pope Francis and Donald Trump. They both run against ideological arguments and much more from common sense. And I think free traders, we'd be better off if we had to argue much more from common sense, from everyday reality rather than from free market ideology. The second point is that we have to now this is a point I give great credit to the Trump campaign for, is that we may have to realize that free trade agreements may not be the same thing as free trade. That many of the problems of crony capitalism, of carve-outs for industries, and of government lobbying, and all these kind of things that go into these massive tomes of legislation might not be the best way to promote free trade. Unilateral free trade, right, might be a preferable thing to having trade negotiations. Issues where protected industries can actually write the legislation that favor competition in other industries but not in theirs. This is similar to the NIMBY argument, right? The not in my backyard argument. It's the way people argue how they hate Congress but love their congressman and keep re-electing him. So we have to realize that sometimes self-interest can get in the way of the benefit of free trade. It's why people often try to protect themselves from competition. It's a natural thing to do. You might know of the Silicon PayPal founder Peter Thiel, right, who says that actually arguing for competition is something no businessman does. In many ways, we need to be pro-market rather than pro-business, right? But nobody really wants to have their status in life challenged. And I think for a long time we looked at blue-collar working class people as simply people who had to go with the flow on free market economics, but no political writer or pundit or politician wants to have that kind of competition in their trade. So again, it's an argument much more in touch with reality rather than with an ideology. And I think Donald Trump has made that case very well during his campaign. It might strike some as odd that he could speak about corrupting legislators from the inside, right? But whether he'll be able to fix it is anyone's guess. But it just shows you that the political process trumps economic arguments many times. Legislators have a way of speaking in favor of free trade but not necessarily delivering it. And I think you've seen this revolt growing for some time within the Republican Party. You may remember in 1992, Pat Buchanan's campaign against trade and immigration. He was a precursor to the Trump campaign and was really the catalyst for a lot of these nationalist arguments in favor of free trade, putting the nation first rather than an abstract ideology. As good as that ideology has served the world's people, there's this idea that we need to take care of people closest to us before we worry about those who are furthest away. The third point I would like to make about why we need to recover moral arguments in favor of free trade. The moral case for free trade is actually a much stronger one than the purely economic case. As an economist, you learn how to draw graphs about marginal utility and marginal cost, about profits and losses, about all these kind of things which sound great to economists, but they don't warm anybody's hearts. They don't have anything to say about the poor or the working classes. Some of you may know who Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute is. He's been going around saying that every Thanksgiving he has a dinner, an argument with his sister. And she always asks him, what are you going to do about the homeless? Right? What are you going to, what free markets, how are they going to help the homeless? How are they going to help the people who are disadvantaged and left out of the economic system? And again, I would say both Pope Francis and Donald Trump have touched on that nerve. And for much too long, those of us in the conservative and libertarian circles have probably either avoided that or de-emphasized it to our own detriment. The economy is about much more than simply the financial economic system, right? We're much more about, we should be closer to Main Street than to Wall Street, to put it very bluntly. Things like taxes and regulations, we can talk about them until we're blue in the face. But average working day people don't always know what the argument in favor of free trade is to actually improve their lives, right? To better society. And I think if we looked at a whole wider range of social factors rather than simply rising incomes, we may be able to make a more effective case. Most of you, if any are familiar with the Austrian School of Economics, right? Arguments about monetary policy can go a long way. Most people have no idea what the dollar is based on or not based on. The Federal Reserve. I mean, again, these are arguments that have been, let's say, within the Republican Party for quite some time, and certainly within the Libertarian Party, but they have yet to kind of go out into the broader public. And if there's one thing about draining the swamp and changing the way the Republican Party addresses working people, I think these are all very important things to talk about from a moral perspective. And the fourth and last point, because I'm actually more interested in discussion than in my own ideas about these things, is finding a way to take that populist spirit, which can very easily result in bad policies, and tying it to a program of reform conservatism. If you want to combine Paul Ryan and Donald Trump working together in some way, that's going to have to be the future for free market arguments. And I think it was pretty clear that Trump was making an argument about specific aspects of free trade agreements, currency manipulation, manufacturing jobs moving abroad, and he may or may not be right about the merits of those, But it's going to have to come down to people who know the policy, who can capture the public imagination. So I think at some point, right, we're going to have to find a way to reform the free market system that we have. Correct, especially the worst aspects of crony capitalism. I have no idea how to do that. I wonder if cronyism isn't actually built into politics, and that since politics always can trump economics because they write the laws and the regulations and the taxes, we're going to have to find a way to address this from within a political perspective. I started studying economics in the late 1980s when it seemed like everybody wanted to study economics to go into business, to make a lot of money. This was considered the normal thing to do. I don't think most economists or economics majors today think about the same things. They actually want to be social entrepreneurs. They want to do things that have some social value. And to be able to marry that efficiency argument with social good is something that Pope Francis talks about, and again, it's something that Donald Trump talks about. And there might be, like I said, it's a very odd couple to come together. I myself, living in Rome, I'm looking forward to that first papal audience that Donald Trump gets. I would love to be a fly on the wall to see what they talk about. I think both of them, though, again, they share something about being elitist themselves, but having that common touch. And it's something that free market advocates need to do a better job of. I will say that there are a number of free market economists who do a great job. I mean, just everybody at Reason, for example, loves talking about the detrimental effects of regulations on the poor. Right? At the local level, I know at the Grassroots Institute you do a very good job of this, showing the detriment of how these things affect the poor and the middle classes, rather than simply talking in terms of graphs and numbers and indexes, which is their place for. But again, it's to marry that strong moral message with the efficiency and progress that comes with economic freedom. So, with that, I'll stop here and take your questions.
Okay, excellent. And also, while he's been here, he's gotten an earful about I was going to say the Jones Act, but actually I'm determined to rename it the Matson Monopoly Act.